In the northwest of Saudi Arabia, black volcanic rock stretches for miles across a field called Harat Kabar. Beneath that scorched ground, a lava tube runs for a mile and a half into total darkness. When a team of scientists finally climbed down into it, their flashlights didn't find bare stone. They found bones. Hundreds of thousands of them, from dozens of species, and scattered among the animal remains, human skulls. By every rule of preservation, none of this should exist. In a desert this harsh, bone usually crumbles within 2 centuries. And yet Saudi Arabia keeps hiding things that, on paper, simply cannot be there. Carvings cut into rock thousands of years before anyone drew a map, 18,000 tombs strung out along roads for the dead, an entire city swallowed whole by sand, and a stretch of desert where the ground itself once caught fire. 13 discoveries. Every single one of them breaks a rule it shouldn't be allowed to break. The tunnel is called Jersin, nearly 1.5 kilometers of underground passageways carved out by ancient rivers of molten rock, the longest lava tube known in Arabia. People in the region had always known it was there, but it wasn't fully explored until 2021, when a joint team from the Saudi Heritage Commission, the Kingdom's Geological Survey, King Saud University, and Germany's Max Planck Institute published their findings in the journal Archaeological and Anthropological Sciences. What they found had been accumulating for roughly 7,000 years. The remains of at least 14 species, including horses, wild and domestic donkeys, camels, goats, ibex, cattle, and hyenas themselves, alongside human skulls. The collector turned out to be the striped hyena, an animal that drags its prey back to its den, gnaws it down, and when the prey is human, typically leaves behind little more than the crown of the skull, after first digging the body out of its grave. Archaeologists carried nearly 2,000 bones and teeth out of that tunnel, every one of them marked with bite wounds, cut marks, or signs of digestion. The striped hyena is almost gone from Arabia today, but 7,000 years ago it ruled these lava fields, and the cool shade of the tunnel preserved its leftovers better than almost anywhere else in the country. The excavation was part of the wider Paleodeserts project, which uses bones and footprints to reconstruct how people and animals once migrated across the peninsula. The most unsettling detail, though, surfaced back in 2007 during the tunnel's very first survey. From somewhere deep inside, the team heard a growl. It seems the den doesn't stay empty forever. To understand where all this ancient life came from, you have to go back much further, 120,000 years, to be exact. In the Nefud Desert, on the bed of a lake that dried up long ago, archaeologists found a site they named Al-Athar, Arabic for the trace. Wind had stripped away the upper layers of sediment, and what emerged on the hardened mud beneath were footprints, 376 of them. Giant extinct elephants, camels, wild horses, buffalo, and among them, 7 human footprints. Based on their size and shape, researchers attributed them to Homo sapiens rather than Neanderthals and dated them to somewhere between 112,000 and 121,000 years ago. If that figure holds, it's the oldest trace of our species ever found on the Arabian Peninsula. The study appeared in Science Advances in 2020. The dating relied on optical stimulated luminescence. Quartz grains from the soil are exposed to light and measured for how much energy they release, which tells researchers the last time that sand actually saw the sun. 4 of the 7 footprints sit close together, moving in the same direction but at different sizes, suggesting 2 or 3 people walking as a group. For a long time, the standard theory held that early humans left Africa by hugging the coastline. But these 7 walked through the interior of the continent, along the shore of a freshwater lake, alongside elephants, the same species that had already gone extinct in the nearby Levant 400,000 years earlier. There was no desert here then. There was savanna, rivers, watering holes. People stopped to drink and moved on. No tools, no signs of a hunt, just a brief pause of a couple of hours, long enough for their footprints to dry and turn to stone. A single morning, frozen for 120,000 years. For generations, local people called certain long stone structures scattered across the landscape the work of old men and walked past them without a second thought. It took an aerial view to reveal what they actually were. They're called mastodons, from the Arabic word for rectangle, long stone enclosures with platforms at either end, ranging from 20 to 620 meters in length. More than 1,600 of them have now been documented, dating to somewhere between 8,500 and roughly 5,000 years ago, which makes them over 2,000 years older than both the Egyptian pyramids and Stonehenge. They form the oldest large-scale monumental landscape on the planet, concentrated most densely around the regions of Alula and Khaybar. Nobody understood their purpose until 2019, when a team led by Melissa Kennedy of the University of Western Australia excavated an untouched mustatill nearly 140 meters long. At its center stood a vertical stone. Around it lay 260 fragments of skulls and horns, mostly cattle, with some goat and gazelle mixed in, the layout of a shrine. The horns had survived so well, right down to the keratin sheath that normally rots away first, that the animals were almost certainly slaughtered on the spot. Kennedy and her colleagues called it the earliest known evidence of a Neolithic cattle cult in Arabia. People with no writing, no metal, no wool hauled stones across the desert, and sacrificed livestock, the most valuable thing they owned. Who they were doing it for, and why, remains a mystery to this day. What we do know is that structures like these were never built alone. From the air, the same desert reveals something else entirely. Stone traps the size of small cities. Archaeologists call them desert kites. Walls stretching up to 5 kilometers converge on an enclosure lined with pits, where animals were driven and killed. A kite this large can only be understood from above, from the ground. It's just a wall vanishing over the horizon. Pilots first spotted them in the 1920s, looking down from their cockpits. More than 6,000 of these structures have since been catalogued across the wider Middle East and Asia. In 2015, researchers found engraved stones near 2 of the kites, though it took years to understand what they were actually looking at. In 2023, a team led by Rémi Crassard of the French National Center for Scientific Research published their conclusion in the journal PLOS1. These were plans, precise, to scale. The 2 stones were found 267 kilometers apart. The Jordanian one measures 80 by 32 centimeters and is roughly 9,000 years old. The Saudi stone, found near Jebel Aziziliyat, is a massive 3.8 by 2.35 meters and about 8,000 years old. These weren't idle scribbles. The proportions, the compass orientation, and the placement of each pit match an actual kite structure, shrunk down by a factor of roughly 175. To draw something like that, someone had to hold in their mind an object no human eye could ever take in from a single point on the ground. It's the oldest scale technical drawing known in human history, created thousands of years before anyone had even invented the concept of a map. Those same hunters left behind something else remarkable, the earliest known portrait of a domesticated dog. At the rock art sites of Shawamis and Juba in the northwest, the cliffs are covered in petroglyphs, hundreds of panels, nearly 7,000 figures in total. Maria Guagnin of the Max Planck Institute counted 349 dogs among them, pricked ears, short muzzles, tails curled into rings, unmistakably resembling the canine breed. Some of these carvings are estimated to be as old as 9,000 years, making them the earliest depictions of dogs ever discovered anywhere. Until this find, the oldest known dog remains on the peninsula had been dated to the 4th millennium BCE, in what is now Yemen. These images predate that by a couple of thousand years. But the real hook isn't even the age. On one panel, a hunter stands among 13 dogs, and lines run from his waist to 2 of them, leashes. If that reading holds, and most researchers do read it that way, it's the earliest depiction of a leashed dog in the world. Humans were training and tethering dogs before they ever learned to plow a field. Why those particular 2 were on a leash, young and untrained, or simply too valuable to risk losing, is still just a guess. It's worth adding a note of caution here. Rock art can't be dated directly. The age comes from patina and weathering patterns, and at least one archaeozoologist, Melinda Zetter, has pushed back on the early date, suggesting the lines could represent a symbolic bond between hunter and animal rather than a literal leash. But even with every caveat attached, the image is hard to shake. 13 dogs, an archer, and 2 taut lines. carved into stone at a time when not a single city yet existed anywhere on Earth. Further north, near the city of Sakaka in the Al-Jawf province, dozens of stone pillars are driven into the ground, a site nicknamed Saudi Arabia's Stonehenge. Locals call them Rajajal, or the Men, because the clusters of standing columns do look uncannily like a crowd of people. There are around 50 groups, each with several pillars standing 2 to 4 meters tall. The first excavations here took place back in 1975 and 1976, and the dating places them at the end of the 5th millennium BCE, roughly 6,000 years old, older than Britain's Stonehenge. From there, it's mostly questions. The stone was hauled in from somewhere far away, shaped and set at an angle, by what method nobody knows. Some pillars later had Thammudic inscriptions carved into them, and their location is no accident. Ancient roads from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Syria all converged here. There are no bones or temple artifacts nearby, which fuels a debate over whether this was a cemetery or a waypoint at the crossing of trade routes. Most of the rows, though, run north to south, which has led to the theory that this was an ancient observatory, that someone here was tracking the sunrise. Here's the strange part. Every schoolchild has heard of Stonehenge, while almost nobody has heard of these pillars, which predate it by over 1,000 years, and this despite the fact that rough estimates put the total number of similar stone structures across Arabia at close to 1 million. Then there's the murkiest story on this list. In the Najd region, in the early 2000s, a local man named Mutlaq ibn Gublan hired an excavator to dig a pond for his camels and, at the last moment, noticed something clearly man-made in the dirt. That's how Al-Maghar was discovered, a Neolithic settlement roughly 9,000 years old. Beneath the mounds lay more than 300 stone objects, figurines of sheep, gazelles, ostriches, dogs, and tools. But one statue drew all the attention, a stone carving of an equine animal, a fragment 86 centimeters long and weighing over 130 kilograms. Across its shoulder ran a raised band, and there were markings near the muzzle. In 2011, Saudi officials announced to the world that this was a bridle, that the horse had been domesticated here 9,000 years ago, some 3,500 years earlier than in the steppes of Central Asia. If confirmed, it would have rewritten the entire history of horse domestication. But the science didn't hold up. Archaeozoologist Hans-Peter Eurtmann and others pushed back, arguing the figure more likely depicts a wild donkey or an onager, that no bones showing where from a bit had ever been found, and that the supposed bridle could simply be a natural fold in the animal's neck. David Anthony, a leading specialist on horse domestication, offered only a cautious maybe. The settlement itself is likely genuine, and the organic dating to the 7th millennium BCE is solid, but the world's oldest bridle remains an unproven, if loudly announced, claim. So it stays marked, disputed. Once again, something hidden in plain sight, visible only from above. In 2021, Matthew Dalton and a team from the University of Western Australia published a discovery in the Holocene that's genuinely chilling in scale. Across the northwest of Arabia run funerary avenues, corridors lined for hundreds of kilometers with stone tombs. Researchers counted roughly 18,000 of them. The team surveyed by helicopter, on foot, and by satellite across an area of at least 160,000 square kilometers. Around 11,000 of the tombs are built directly into the roads themselves. Many are shaped like a pendant on a chain and are known locally as pendant tombs. They date to around 4,500 years ago, the 3rd millennium BCE, the exact period when the pyramids were rising in Egypt. The roads stitched together the oases of Khaybar, Alula, and Tema, and the tombs cluster most densely wherever water was found. The area around Khaybar has been called one of the densest cemetery landscapes on Earth. Out of 18,000 graves, only 80 have been excavated. Nobody can say for certain why people buried their dead along the roads, though one theory holds that it was a way of marking territory, laying loved ones beside the paths you walked every day, so there was always somewhere to stop and remember them. Bedouin communities always knew these stones were there. It took a satellite to reveal that they formed a network hundreds of kilometers long. One of the oases along those roads, Khaybar, was hiding a secret of its own. In 2024, a joint French-Saudi team combined satellite imagery with excavation data and revealed that the entire oasis had once been ringed by a wall, 14.5 kilometers long, between 1.5 and nearly 2.5 meters thick and roughly 5 meters tall. About 40% of it survives today, and along that surviving stretch stand 74 bastions. The wall enclosed nearly 1,100 hectares and was built during the Bronze Age, sometime between the 23rd and 20th centuries BC. Khaybar wasn't unique. Similar walls once surrounded the oases of Tema, Korea, and Huwait, forming an entire network of fortified settlements. Millennia had reshaped the landscape so thoroughly that without satellite data, the wall's scale simply went unnoticed. Inside it, researchers found an entire fortified town from the same period named Al-Nada, 2.5 hectares, home to roughly 500 people, abandoned around 1500 BC. It survived largely because it was buried under black basalt rock, which kept looters away. What matters most here isn't even the wall, it's the pace. Northwest Arabia eased into urban life slowly and cautiously, nothing like the rapid growth happening at the same time in Mesopotamia. It followed its own separate road toward civilization, behind its own fortress walls. If Khaybar was hidden by a wall, the next city was hidden by the sand itself. On the edge of the Rub, Al-Khali, roughly 700 kilometers southwest of Riyadh, once stood Kiryat Al-Faw, capital of the ancient kingdom of Kinda and a wealthy caravan hub. Kinda is considered the first nomadic Arab monarchy. The city resurfaced in the 1940s, when Aramco oil workers passed through the area, and Saudi archaeologist Abdul Rahman Al-Ansari later spent nearly 40 years excavating it. Around the 5th century CE, its residents left all at once, and the desert closed over the city completely. Drones, ground-penetrating radar, and laser scanning have since revealed that a living organism survived intact beneath the dunes. 5 temples from different eras, a royal palace, a 3-story marketplace with 7 storage towers, residential quarters, and an entire water system, canals, cisterns, 17 major wells, and hundreds of pits designed to channel the region's rare rainfall onto the fields. In total, nearly 12,000 objects and more than 2,500 graves have been recovered from the site. In July 2024, Kiryat Al-Faw was added to the UNESCO World Heritage List, the 8th such site in the country. An entire capital, with a palace, a market, and temples, once held water in one of the driest corners of the planet, and then, in the 5th century, its people abandoned it all at once. Nobody has ever found a satisfying answer as to why. And in the oasis of Tema sat, perhaps, the wildest story on this entire list. 6th century BC. A man arrives here who, by every measure, has absolutely no business being in this remote corner of Arabia, Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, who ruled from 556 to 539 BC. He abandons Babylon, the greatest city in the known world at the time, and rules his empire from the desert for nearly a decade, leaving his son Belshazzar to hold the capital. Why he did it has been debated for centuries. A falling out with the priests of the god Marduk, an obsession with the moon god Sin, or simply illness. For a long time, all of this was known only from ancient texts, but since 2005, German archaeologist Arnulf Hausleiter and his colleagues have been excavating Tema, and in 2021 they uncovered a stone inscription bearing Nabonidus's own name. No longer legend, now it was stone. The name of that same son, Belshazzar, would resurface centuries later in the biblical book of Daniel, on the very night Babylon fell. And the trail keeps going. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls is a text known as the Prayer of Nabonidus, describing a Babylonian king who spent 7 years away from people in an oasis, praying for healing. The last ruler of Babylon, governing his empire from an Arabian desert oasis, and turning up centuries later in manuscripts found beside the Dead Sea. This isn't the plot of a novel. It's an excavation report. A couple of centuries after Nabonidus, in that same region near Alula, rose Hegra, often called Petra's younger sister, built by the same Nabatean people. More than 110 tombs are carved directly into the sandstone cliffs, nearly 100 of them fronted by monumental facades with columns and relief carvings. The city flourished from the 1st century BCE through the 1st century CE under the Nabatean king Aretas IV. Before the Nabateans, the area had belonged to the Lycianites, and in 106 CE the land was absorbed into the Roman Empire. But the real marvel here isn't the beauty of the tombs, it's the water. The Nabateans cut dozens of wells into the rock and soil and developed irrigated farming in a place that shouldn't have been survivable, and that water supported their control of the incense route, along which frankincense and myrrh flowed toward the Mediterranean. The most famous tomb, Qasr al-Farid, the lonely castle, was carved from a single freestanding rock in the middle of the plain and left unfinished. You can still see clearly that the stone was cut from the top down. And from an inscription on one of the tombs, archaeologists reconstructed the face of a woman named Heinet, buried here 2,000 years ago. In 2008, Hijra became Saudi Arabia's first UNESCO World Heritage Site. The city emptied out before the rise of Islam, but the dry air preserved it almost whole. Standing beneath a facade the height of a 3-story building, it's hard to believe these people ever managed to outplay the desert, even if only for a while. And one final stop, where we surface out of deep antiquity and land almost in the present day. It's 1932, and British explorer Harry St. John Philby is crossing the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, in search of a legendary city that, according to tradition and the Quran, was wiped off the face of the earth for its sins. Philby called it Wabar. After a month of travel in heat brutal enough to kill several of his camels, on the 2nd of February he emerges not into a city, but onto a stretch of desert about half a square kilometer in size, littered with white sandstone, chunks of iron and black glass. These were meteorite craters. Several of them, the largest measuring around 116 meters across. An iron meteorite had struck here, and the heat had fused the sand into glass, roughly 9 parts desert sand to 1 part meteoritic iron and nickel. Glass beads were scattered around the site, growing smaller with distance from the craters, sorted by the wind. The object had entered the ground at a very shallow angle, at a speed above 10 kilometers per second. In the 1990s, the famed crater researcher Eugene Shoemaker made his way there and recounted everything. The largest fragment weighs more than 2 tons. It's nicknamed the Camel's Hump, and it now greets visitors at the National Museum in Riyadh. There are 2 twists to this story. The first, Wabar, is a corruption of Ubar, but the real, legendary Ubar was never actually found by Philby. It wasn't located until 1992, roughly 400 kilometers to the south. The second twist, and the bigger one, the craters aren't ancient at all. Dating suggests the meteorite most likely fell just a few centuries ago, possibly around 1704, the day Arabian sand literally caught fire and fused into glass, which, by historical standards, happened practically yesterday. 13 discoveries, 13 layers of a single country, buried beneath sand that also conceals a green savanna, dead kings, and glass that fell from the sky.